Purify yourselves and purify the temple of the Lord, the God of your ancestors. Remove all the defiled things from the sanctuary. The Lord has chosen you to stand in his presence, to minister to him, and to lead the people in worship and present offerings to him. So the temple of the Lord was restored to service. And Hezekiah and all the people rejoiced because of what God had done for the people, for everything had been accomplished so quickly. There was great joy in the city. Then the priests and the Levites stood and blessed the people, and God heard their prayer from his holy dwelling in heaven.
It's good to be here. I just want to start with a simple question. Now, don't worry, it's a rhetorical one, so you don't need to say anything. In fact, you can turn to your neighbour and just say, don't worry, he's not one of those preachers who makes us say things to each other. So I just want to start with a question. This question is, have you ever seen God's glory fall among the church? Have you ever seen his glory manifest, displayed, made clear amongst the church? If someone said to you, these passages in the Bible where it talks God's glory fell and this happened, what's that like? Would you be able to say to them, this is what it's like, this is what I remember, this is what happens? I'm going to start with an example of what happened for the church in the Hebridean revival when this happened, what happened for them. And we've heard a lot about the Hebridean revival over the last few months, and I'm sure a lot of you remember it starts with two sisters, Peggy and Christine Smith, who were praying and felt God speak to them in a verse in Isaiah, where Isaiah says, I will pour out water on him that is thirsty and floods upon the dry ground. And they took this promise and they said, God is going to do something amongst us. And they prayed and they prayed and they prayed, and revival broke out on the Isle of Lewis where they were. But there's one village where revival just wasn't breaking out, just wasn't taking place. And eventually one of the elders of the church there, called Duncan Campbell, who was the main kind of evangelist during that revival, they called him and he said to him, Mr. Campbell, there's only... Well, I won't do the accent, don't worry. It's weird. Mr. Campbell, there's only one thing we can do. We must give ourselves to prayer. Prayer changes things. So Donald Campbell basically said, tell me the time, tell me the place, we'll be there. So it says they gathered together, there's about 30 of them. They went to this farmhouse in Arnall. Now, I Googled farmhouses in Arnall, so it could be that one, it could not be. I haven't done any more fact-checking than Google. But they went to a house, something like that, and they started praying, 30 of them. And Donald Campbell says it was tough going. He says they were praying, and it was just hard work. But they stuck at it, and they prayed, and they prayed, and they prayed. They prayed through the evening, they prayed through the night, and Donald Campbell, in his own words, says about sometime after midnight, he turned to this guy, one of the elders of the church, a blacksmith, and he says, John, I feel God wants you to pray for us. And this is what Donald Campbell then says in his own words happened. He says, John rose to his feet with his cap in his hand and prayed a prayer that will never be forgotten by those who were present. He must have prayed for about half an hour. Now to stop there, half an hour. Half an hour. They've been praying all evening, all night. Suddenly someone stands up and prays for half an hour. Hands up, let's be honest. Who's sneaking out the door while that prayer's going on? I struggle to think I would have had the stamina to stick through this, but more fool me. He must have prayed for about half an hour. Then pausing for a second, he looked up towards heaven and concluded with these words, God, do you know that your honor is at stake? Do you know that your honor is at stake? You promised to pour water on the thirsty and floods on the dry ground. And God, you are not doing it. How many of us would have the boldness to pray a prayer like that? I stand before you as an empty vessel, and I'm thirsty. Thirsting for thee and for a manifestation of thy power. I'm thirsty to see the devil defeated in this parish. I'm thirsty to see this community gripped as you gripped Barvas, that's the town down the road where the revival started. I'm longing for revival, and God, you are not doing it. I am thirsty, and you promised to pour water on me. Then a pause. And after a moment of tense silence, he cried, God, your honor is at stake. I now take it upon myself to challenge you to fulfill your covenant engagement. It's a bold prayer, full of faith. They've been praying for hours and hours. Nothing's happening. Tough going. This guy stands up and prays a prayer like that. Now, it was nearing 2 o'clock in the morning at this point. And what happened? The house shook. See that house? It's a steady house. That's a solid house. The house shook. A jug on the sideboard fell to the floor and broke. My mind went back to Acts chapter 4 when they prayed and the place was shaken. There are those in Arnold today who will verify to the fact that while the brother prayed, the dishes on the dresser rattled as God turned loose his mighty power, and wave after wave of divine power swept through the room. Imagine being there. You've prayed for hours and hours. It's been hard work. Nothing's happening. Suddenly, God turns up. The whole house is shaking. Things are falling off and breaking. The dishes are rattling. But not just that house was affected. Donald Campbell says, simultaneously, the Spirit of God swept through the village, and people could not sleep. Houses were lit all night as people arose to pray. People walked the streets in great conviction. Others knelt at their bedsides crying. And that is how the Arnold revival broke out. And oh, what a sweeping revival. I don't believe there was a single house in the village of Arnold that wasn't shaken by God. How much do you want that? And that was their prayer meetings. Now, it's easy to think, oh, that's one-off, that's a one story. But actually, as I've been reading about the Hebrides revival this week, I was spoilt for choice of times where God just flattened everyone in a prayer meeting. It just got me thinking, what are our prayer meetings like? What are our prayer meetings like? Because they're not like that. And now I know there is a time for faithfulness and a time for perseverance and pushing through. But I want to see God's presence and his glory fall like that. Now, I'm talking about God's glory, and I think it might just be helpful to set in our minds what I mean when I'm saying that. When I'm talking about God's glory, it's like the air just gets heavy with the weight of God. It's like you can just feel in the atmosphere the weightiness, the heaviness of God. And it's like, if you imagine if I just opened up these doors and let a tiger come out here, your attention is going to get transfixed by that tiger. You are going to be staring at that tiger. You're not going to care about whether you've had a good night's sleep, a bad night's sleep, whether you're a bit too hot, a bit too cold, whether it's a stressful week or a relaxing week, what's coming up or what's gone behind. You are just going to be transfixed by that tiger. That's what it's like when God's glory breaks out. You're transfixed. There's no other consideration. Nothing else in your mind that's weighing on you. You are just watching it. And just like if I were to let out a nice tiger, there's a picture in case anyone's unsure what a tiger is. If I were to let that out, there would be a sense of fear. There would be a sense of, this thing is too strong for me. I cannot handle this thing. And every time when God's glory breaks out, we see people start to tremble. So often when an angel or a vision of God appears, the first thing they have to say is, do not fear. Because the first response, I'm talking about when God's glory falls, there is an overwhelming sense of awe that comes from a recognition of the power and the brilliance of what we're witnessing. That's what I want to see amongst us, guys. That's what I want to see. Now, we've seen glimpses. I remember 4 years ago, we had Mervis come over from South Africa. He's a prophet in South Africa that we're connected to through 412. And he came over, and we were at Port St. Mary, weren't we? And he just got up on the stage with his guitar, and he just played some songs. They weren't even songs we knew. He just sort of made them up as he went along, and we just sang, a couple of lines over and over again. But God's presence that night was like nothing I've ever felt before. I remember saying to Megan as we came home, I felt like I could have just leant back, and the presence of God was so thick in the air that it would have held me up. It was just a sense of that heaviness, that weight of glory being there. And we've been looking at Hezekiah recently, and Hezekiah was a man who understood God's glory. He was a man who saw God work through Israel and do amazing things in his reign. He was a man who saw revivals of people as hearts came back to God, of the temple was opened up, the word was proclaimed again. But Hezekiah was a man who also let his understanding of glory impact his prayer life. And the way he prayed, we can see how Hezekiah understood God's glory and how aware he was of God's greatness and his glory. So we're going to look at this prayer that Hezekiah prays in a moment, and I just want us to catch Hezekiah's heart in this prayer. Now, to set the scene, Hezekiah is the king of Judah, and a rival king, a guy called Sennacherib, which is a great name. We've got an Azariah. Maybe we're going to go for a Sennacherib later, just so we can really make sure no one's got the same biblical name as us. So this guy Sennacherib, he's the king of Assyria. He's the most powerful man on the planet at that point. He's been conquering everything before him. And he sends Hezekiah a letter, and the letter basically says, I can't get to you now, but don't think you're getting off. I'm going to be back soon, and you're going to cop it. He says, I've destroyed every other land before me. Every other god of those lands has been powerless before me. So don't make the mistake of thinking your God is any different to anyone else. I'm coming. I know where you live. That's the Edward Graham paraphrase version. It's slightly different in the NIV. So it then says, after getting this message, this is what Hezekiah does. After Hezekiah received the letter from the messengers and read it, he went up to the Lord's temple and spread it out before the Lord. Hezekiah prayed this prayer before the Lord. O Lord God of Israel, you are enthroned between the mighty cherubim. You alone are God of all the kingdoms of the earth. You alone created the heavens and the earth. Bend down, O Lord, and listen. Open your eyes, O Lord, and see. Listen to Sennacherib's words of defiance against the living God. It is true, Lord, that the kings of Assyria have destroyed all these nations, and that they have thrown the gods of these nations into the fire and burned them. But of course the Assyrians could destroy them. They were not gods at all, only idols of wood and stone shaped by human hands. Now, O Lord our God, rescue us from his power. Then all the kingdoms of the earth will know that you alone, O Lord our God. Then Isaiah the son of Amoz sent this message to Hezekiah. This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I have heard your prayer about King Sennacherib of Assyria. Who would love to hear a word like that after you've just prayed? Someone just completely unrelated comes to you and says, God just wants to say, he's heard your prayer. Don't worry, he's got it. And Isaiah goes on to say, this is what God's going to do. He's going to completely remove this threat. And actually what happens is an angel, just one angel, goes out amongst the Assyrian army. And in one night, he strikes down 185,000 soldiers of Sennacherib's army. And the Assyrians wake up in the morning and think, game's over. And they just go home. And that's the last we hear of Sennacherib. Hezekiah was a man who understood the glory of God, and that is why he prays a prayer like this. Now, this passage is a very nice personal one to me, because I remember when I was at university, I had a moment where I was doing my degree, and I turned in an essay, and I got an email back saying, you haven't observed this kind of protocol, and we're docking you 10 marks on your essay. And at this point, I really needed some good grades. I really needed some good ones to kind of bump me up. And so I emailed back and said, I know I didn't observe that, but the lecturer said he wasn't that fussed about this protocol, and so we didn't actually need to do it. He wouldn't mind, so that's why I've done this. So please, you can check it with him. Take pity on me. Please don't dock me the 10 marks. And I'd actually read this passage in my quiet time that morning. So I thought, I know what I can do here. So I got my laptop. I loaded up the email that I'd got from the philosophy department, and I spread it out. I went to my bedroom, which was the only private place I had in the house, spread it out on my bed, and I was like, Lord, I'm praying like Hezekiah here. I'm doing what he did. Please, can you do something and not let them dock me these marks? I need these marks. Please, God, come through for me. And within about 45 minutes, an hour of praying that prayer, I got an email back from the philosophy department saying, we've looked at it, we've spoken to the lecturer, he doesn't remember ever saying that, we're docking you the 10 marks, tough. Encouraging, isn't it? But as I was reflecting on that, I was thinking, actually, that's so easy for us to do, to fall into that trap, to think, I've read this passage, Hezekiah goes to this place, he spreads out the letter, he prays this sort of a prayer, brilliant, I do that, God's going to come through. That's the answer. And actually, that's the trap we fall into whenever we look at prayer, to think, okay, that's it, A, B, C, D, brilliant, I'll get the result. But actually, what we learn here is not, this is the way to pray, step by step. What we learn here is not, do these things and God will answer in this way. What we learn here is actually about the heart of Hezekiah. And something I hadn't actually grasped at that stage, and I just thought, okay, do these things, brilliant, God will come through, happy days. So what I want us to do is not to think, okay, how can I imitate Hezekiah here? But how can I capture his heart? How can I understand God like he did? And how can I love God like he did? And then that, just like that, transformed Hezekiah's prayers. That's going to transform ours. So just look at how he starts and ends his prayer. O Lord God of Israel, you are enthroned between the mighty cherubim. You alone are God of all the kingdoms of the earth. You alone created the heavens and the earth. And then he concludes, now, O Lord God, rescue us from his power. Then all the kingdoms of the earth will know that you alone are God. You see, he understands two things, does Hezekiah. He understands the glory of God and the dwelling place of God. And those are the two things I want us to understand. So here's your cheat at lunch. You can say, Ed's head said, Hezekiah understood the dwelling place of God and the glory of God. So let's start with the glory of God. So like I was saying, the glory of God is when we get transfixed by that vision of his power, his might, and his brilliance, when everything else completely vanishes into the background, and when we're just aware of that heaviness, that weight of his presence. Understanding God's glory comes from understanding his nature and his raw, phenomenal power. You see, Hezekiah was a man who was advised throughout his reign by this guy, Isaiah, who comes in at the end. And Isaiah, we know, is a prophet. We've got his entire book of prophecy in the Bible. And Isaiah would have talked to Hezekiah. He would have explained things to him. He would have been his go-to man when he wants to know what God is thinking, what God is doing, or how he should act in obedience to God. And I'm sure Isaiah would have told Hezekiah about when Isaiah, there's too many I's in this sentence, isn't it? Should just stay with H and I. I'm sure he would have told him about when he was called by God. Pronouns are no good. That's confusing. Hezekiah would have been told what Isaiah saw. In Isaiah 6, he says, in the year King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting on a throne. See how it starts? Exactly the same idea with Hezekiah's prayer. Lord, you're enthroned above the cherubim. Exact same starting place. Isaiah says, I saw the Lord sitting on a throne, high and lifted up. The train of his robe filled the temple. Attending him were the mighty seraphim, those are angels, each having 6 wings. With 2 wings they covered their faces, with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they flew. And they were calling to each other, holy, holy, holy is the Lord of heaven's armies. The whole earth is full of his glory. Their voices shook the temple to its foundations, and the entire building was filled with smoke. That was Isaiah's call when God first appeared to him and revealed that he was going to use Isaiah to speak to the nations. And this, I'm sure, is what Isaiah would have communicated at times to Hezekiah. There's just one thing I want us to look at in that story. That Isaiah said he saw these angels with 6 wings. And he says with 2 wings they covered their faces, 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they flew. Now, I said at the start about what an angel can do. One random angel, not named, we're not told anything about this angel, just one angel can go out and is powerful enough, strong enough to strike down 185,000 soldiers in one night. That is a powerful being. These beings are sinless beings. They've never fallen, never had so much as an impure thought in their heads, never told even the whitest of white lies, never done anything for a moment that wasn't completely directed at glorifying God. These are pretty phenomenal creatures to behold, and yet look how they respond to God. They've got 6 wings. With 2, they're covering their faces. They daren't even look at the glory of God. With 2, they're covering their feet, even though they're created in perfection, never having tasted the fall. There's still this sense of this body is not worthy to be in the same presence as this. And with 2 wings, they're constantly flying. They daren't stay still. They daren't stay still in the presence of God. Sinless, perfect, powerful beings stand before God, and this is their reaction. That is a glorious God. That is a beautiful God. That is the understanding of God that Isaiah had, that Hezekiah had, that we need to capture, that brilliance, that wonder. And we need to be comfortable with the uncomfortableness of that presence. So that's where he starts, the Lord sitting high up on a throne. But then he goes on, doesn't he, to talk about his raw creative power, the God who created all things, the King of all the nations. He's harking back to Genesis 1 when we're told the very first verse in the Bible, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was formless and empty. Darkness covered the deep waters. The Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters. Then God said, let there be light, and there was light. That is the power and the raw creative energy of God. It doesn't say that it was a bit dim and God said, well, this kind of brightness is good, let's just turn it up a bit. No, it was completely empty, completely blank, completely dark, and God spoke into it complete creation out of nothing, not taking something that was already a good idea and making it better. Complete imaginative power, able to imagine something when there is nothing. That is the creativity of our God. And as we're praying, that's what we need to be aware of. That we're not praying to God thinking, God, maybe there's this avenue that you could use. So I'll give you a few tips. You could come in this way and do this. You could do that. We worship a God who doesn't need any tips. He doesn't need the beginnings of a way to come through to save us. He didn't need the beginning of a world to come through. He didn't even need the beginnings of an army for Hezekiah. He can do it all himself. That is his power. That is his creativity. And if you are sitting here and you've got your own personal Sennacherib, your own personal Assyrian army that's around you, whether it be sickness, whether it be financial troubles, relational troubles, be comforted that you don't need to understand at this point how God can turn this situation around. We worship the God who can take nothingness and create everything. But he doesn't just take nothingness once, set it up, set it spinning and walk away. We worship the God who is continually at work in his creation, upholding it. I think this is an understanding, actually, we're somewhat in danger of losing these days. This is how the Hebrews used to understand God. This is what it says in Psalm 147. He covers the heavens with cloud and provides rain for the earth. He makes the grass grow in mountain pastures. He gives food to the wild animals and feeds the young ravens when they cry. That's how the people of God of old used to understand his work. And they understood it like that, not because they were lacking a 21st century person to come along and say, oh, actually, ravens have instinct and they just find their food on their own. And actually, the water cycle does this, so it just runs. They understood all about animal instincts. They understood all about water is there, it goes up, it rains. They didn't need help understanding that, but they understood that there is a God at work amongst all of it. They understood that God is at work, and we can talk about how the process works. We can talk about how he does these things, but the inescapable truth is that he's doing it. Think about it. If you come to me and ask me, why is the kettle boiling? I can give you my perfect GCSE science explanation of, well, the current goes through this bit and it heats it up, and that transfers through to the atoms, and they wobble a bit more than they used to, and it all spreads out, becomes a gas, and that's boiling. I can tell you all that. But I can also tell you I want a cup of tea. Do you want one? And those two explanations are perfectly compatible side by side. And we, I think, are in danger sometimes of losing the awe of God at work because we're so used to this idea that creation just runs itself. And we've kind of taken on this enlightenment view that God kind of maybe created the world, set it running, and then he's just walked off. And now we're just over here kind of making do. But that's not how Hezekiah understood God. And that's why he could pray like he did, because he knew God was constantly at work. We sometimes, when we think about miracles, I don't know about you, but I sometimes fall into the trap of thinking a miracle is like when God reaches down and does something. Like if God reaches down and moves the microphone and hides it. And we can't see God, so we're like, oh, that's a miracle, because, something's happened. God's reached down and done something. But actually, that's not a miracle, because that implies that it's perfectly possible for God to be not interacting with the microphone at all. It's perfectly possible for God to be not interacting. And the normal default way of understanding life is that God doesn't do anything. And every now and again, he does do something. And that's a miracle. That's miraculous. But actually, what a miracle is just when God reveals to us what he's doing second by second every moment. A miracle is not the exception. It's just the revelation of what's always happening. So when we pray, we need to hold that understanding. The God who is enthroned above all things, glorious, perfect. The God who can create anything out of absolute nothingness. And the God who is continually, moment by moment, upholding every single thing in existence. And we see that understanding brings Hezekiah to quite a surprising conclusion to his prayer. I don't know about you guys, but I would not have ended this prayer this way. He finishes, now, O Lord our God, rescue us from his power. Then all the kingdoms of earth will know that you alone, O Lord our God. He doesn't finish it saying, God, please save us, because otherwise we're going to get wiped out. God, please save us, because otherwise I'm not going to be a king anymore. I'm going to lose everything. He concludes saying, God, please save us, because if you don't, everyone else is going to think you're just like the idols of all the other nations that the Assyrians could walk all over. If you don't save us, people aren't going to realize how glorious and powerful you are. Do you see the echo in there of John Smith's prayer? God, your honor is at stake here. If the Assyrians wipe us out, you will look no better than an idol made of stone and wood. Your honor is at stake, so please step in and save us so that you might be seen by everyone to be as glorious as you are. It's a completely different way of praying. Again, I in my life have taken this and gone, brilliant, that's how I need to pray. So anytime I pray, I need to think, how can I convince God this is for his glory? It's like, when you need to ask someone to do something, so you tell them about how great it will be for them. And you're like, Megs, I really want you to have a cup of tea, but I don't want you to just have any cup of tea. I want you to have the best cup of tea imaginable. And they always say the best food is the food you prepare yourself. So while you're making that cup of tea, can you make me one? I have prayed prayers like that to God, as laughable as it sounds. God, if you do this, maybe someone else might see this. You could be glorified in that way, so please can you give me my cup of tea? Again, that's not the way we're doing it. We need to have this take root in our hearts, this understanding. We need to have that prayer like John Smith prayed. Your honor is at stake. We're not praying it for us. We're praying it because we want to see you glorified, because we understand you are glorious. This is the key to us seeing a revival of prayer and a revival in this church, is understanding the glory of God and being desperate for that glory. Lastly, I just want to bring us to a conclusion on Hezekiah understood the dwelling place of God. He understood where God was. He starts his prayer, O Lord, the God of Israel, you are enthroned between the mighty cherubim. Which leads us to the obvious question, well, where are these cherubim? Now, cherubim, if you're not familiar, they're a kind of a picture of this angelic being that's kind of part lion, part eagle, part man. So if you imagine a lion's body, a man's head, and then these huge wings coming out of it. And various times we see God pictured with these beings. And it's easy to think, oh, well, these are angelic beings. They must be far up above us all in heaven. But actually, I don't think that's what Hezekiah is thinking of here. You see, Hezekiah, we're told, goes to the temple to pray this prayer. So he's in the temple, and he can see before him the Holy of Holies. He can see the curtain coming down. He knows in that room is the Holy of Holies. And we're told that when Solomon was building the temple, when he designed that room, the Holy of Holies, where God's presence was to be, it says he prepared the inner sanctuary, or the Holy of Holies, at the far end of the table, where the ark of the Lord's covenant would be placed, and he made 2 cherubim, wild olive wood, each 15 feet tall, and he placed them in the inner sanctuary. See, when he's praying this prayer, he's not praying your God who's miles up above us all, far away. He's praying it, you are the God who is there, mere meters from where he's standing. He's saying, that's where you are, God. You are amongst us. You are in the midst of us. You're not somewhere far up that I need to pray and shout as loud as I can so that you can hear me. You are right here amongst us. He understood. This is a diagram that's coming up of that's what it would have looked like. I like to think that's Hezekiah, but I don't think that is supposed to be Hezekiah. But you can see in that there's kind of a cut through of the temple, and there's the 2 cherubim in the Holy of Holies. That's how close he would have felt he was standing to the very presence of God. And he's saying, God, you are right amongst us. You are right here with us. You can hear me even if I whisper. You are right here amongst us. Please come through. Glorify yourself in this situation. So that's where Hezekiah went to pray. So that brings us to the question, well, where's the temple for us? When I told you that story of me making a fool of myself at the start, I went up to my bedroom, to a nice private place where I could pray. Hezekiah didn't go private with his prayer. He went to the temple. The temple for us, we know from Ephesians 2, we're told by Paul, in him you also are being built together into a dwelling place for God by the Spirit. We know that we are the temple. This church is the temple, not this cinema building, not this format of doing a Sunday morning. I think our danger is not that we think church is a building. Our danger is that we think church is a program, that if we do, someone welcomes us, we sing some songs, someone preaches, and then we have a response. That's church. That's where our danger is, but that is not what Paul says. Paul says you are being built together into this temple. You are the dwelling place of God. And that's where we need to be. If we want to see God's glory fall amongst us, if we want to see his power let loose amongst us and revival break out on this island, it's not going to happen when we all go sit in our rooms and pray and have great prayer times on our own. It happens when the church comes together. When the church as a whole, every one of us, is seized by a desperation for prayer and a desperation for God's glory. There won't be a revival in the prayer life of the church unless there is a prayer life of the church. Not just a few of us, not just most of us, all of us consumed by this desire, this passion that God might be glorified, praying like Hezekiah, Lord, do this so that everyone on this island might know that you alone, O Lord, are God. Great moves of God happen when God's people come together. I just want to finish with this picture. Just think of when Solomon dedicated his temple. And we're told in Kings that the glory of God fell and the priests had to run out the temple because they couldn't do their job. It was just too full of the presence of God. They couldn't do what they wanted. And then when God dedicates his new temple at Pentecost, when the church is dedicated to be the new temple of God, what happens? God's glory falls again. And again, the disciples, the 120 of them that were gathered, flee out of where they are. But it's not because they can't do their offices as priests. It's not because the glory of God is too strong and they can't do what they were commissioned to do. Now, because God's glory has fallen, they can do what they were commissioned to do. Now, because God's glory has come, they can be the witnesses that Jesus wanted them to be. He told them, stay where you are until power comes. And when power comes, you will be equipped. You see, if we want to be the church God is calling us to be, we need his presence manifest amongst us. We could be a church operating at 50%, 30% capacity or 30% efficiency, and that might be great. But we want to be a church that's doing 100% of what God is calling us to do. We don't want to be a church that settles for the small stuff. We want to be a church that God uses like he used that church in the Hebrides to bring revival across us. And that is only going to happen when we are praying, begging God to make his glory known amongst us, and when we're seeing that happen. Amen. I've been so convicted this week of wanting that passion like John Smith prayed with. I am thirsty, Lord. And I've been so moved thinking, am I thirsty enough? Am I thirsty enough? Do I think I would like this to happen like I'd like someone else to happen? I wanted England to win the Rugby World Cup. I really did. But they didn't, and it's not made that big an impact on my life, to be honest. Is that the same thirst I've got for God, where I think I'd like that to happen? Or is it that I want it like, a Boy Scout wants to get his badge so he can sew it on his sash and move on with his life? I don't want it to be like that. I want it to be an absolute passion, that I desperately want this to happen amongst us.